The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and Dalton Cale had made plenty. 3 days without food, one canteen left. The kind of thirst that makes your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth and your thoughts go sideways. He'd been checking his trap since dawn, hoping for anything. A rabbit, a snake, something. But when he crested the ridge and saw the body lying face down in the sand, he knew his day was about to get a hole. Lot worse because the boy wasn't moving, and the blood trailing from his leg said he'd been that way for hours. What Dalton didn't know yet was that saving this kid would bring 300 armed riders to his door by sunrise. The sun hammered down without mercy as Dalton stumbled toward the figure sprawled in the dust. His boots kicked up small clouds with each step, and his vision wavered at the edges. The boy couldn't have been more than 12, dressed in traditional Apache clothing with a red cloth tied around his forehead. A gash ran deep across his thigh, crusted with dried blood and sand. Dalton dropped to his knees beside him and pressed 2 fingers against the kid's neck. A pulse faint but there. The boy's lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin hot enough to fry an egg on. Dalton looked down at the canteen hanging from his belt. The weight of it suddenly felt like an anchor. He unscrewed the cap slowly, watching the boy's chest rise and fall in shallow, desperate breaths. 1 canteen, maybe 2 days' worth if he rationed it right. Maybe enough to get him to the next town if he left now. If he didn't stop, if he didn't look back. He thought about it. He won't lie about that. For a solid minute, Dalton Cale sat there in the dirt, weighing his life against a stranger's. The kid was Apache. That meant his people were probably looking for him. That meant if they found Dalton with him, there'd be questions. Hard questions. The kind that came with arrows and lances and a whole lot of anger. But then the boy made a sound, a weak, broken whimper that barely qualified as human, and Dalton's hand moved before his brain caught up. He tilted the canteen to the boy's lips and let the water trickle in slowly. The kid choked at first, coughing weakly, then his throat worked in desperate swallows. Dalton gave him 3 long pulls before forcing himself to stop. The boy's eyes fluttered open for just a second. Dark, unfocused, terrified, then closed again. Dalton tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped it tight around the leg wound. It wasn't much, but it slowed the bleeding. The sun was starting its descent when Dalton finally hoisted the kid onto his shoulders and started the long walk back to his rancho. Every step felt like dragging himself through mud. His own thirst screamed at him with each passing minute, but he'd made his choice. The boy's weight pressed down on him like a judgment he couldn't escape. By the time the broken-down structure of his place came into view, Dalton's legs were shaking and his vision had narrowed to a dark tunnel. He laid the boy on the only piece of furniture he had left, a wooden bench near the empty fireplace. The rancho was barely standing, walls full of gaps where the wind whistled through at night. No livestock, no supplies. Just dust and memories of better times. Dalton checked the wound again, cleaned it with the last splash of water from his canteen, and sat back against the wall. The empty canteen hung from his hand like a death sentence. The night passed in fragments. Dalton drifted in and out, his body too exhausted to stay. Conscious, but too wired to truly sleep. The boy stirred a few times, mumbling words Dalton couldn't understand. Fever. Dreams probably. When the first gray light of dawn started creeping through the cracks in the walls, Dalton finally let himself close his eyes for real. That's when he heard it, a sound that pulled him back from the edge of sleep, like a rope yanking him upright. Low and rhythmic, distant but growing closer. The unmistakable thunder of hooves. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Dalton staggered to the door and pushed it open. The horizon was moving. A wall of dust rose into the pale morning sky, and beneath it, the dark shapes of riders spread across the desert like a stain. His heart dropped into his boots. They weren't slowing down. They were coming straight for him. Dalton's hand went to his hip out of instinct, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He'd sold his rifle 3 months back when the hunger got bad enough. Now he stood in the doorway of his falling apart rancho with nothing but his bare hands and a dying Apache boy behind him. The riders kept coming, their shapes solidifying through the dust like something out of a fever dream. Dozens became hundreds. The ground started to vibrate beneath his feet. He could run. The thought flashed through his mind sharp and clear. Grab what little he had, slip out the back, disappear into the rocks before they circled around. But his legs wouldn't move. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was something else. He made his choice when he gave that kid his water. Running now wouldn't change what was coming. The first line of riders broke through the dust cloud about 200 yards out. Apache warriors on horseback spread across the desert in a formation that looked like it could swallow his entire property. They wore traditional dress, some with painted faces, others with leather wrappings and feathers tied into their hair. Every single one of them carried weapons, lances, bows, shields decorated with symbols Dalton couldn't read. They moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of riding together. Years of surviving, years of fighting. Dalton stepped out from the doorway and into the open. His shirt was torn wear. He'd ripped fabric for the boy's bandage. His face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows in the morning light. He probably looked half dead already. The riders slowed as they approached, forming a massive semicircle that cut off every escape route. The sound of hooves gradually faded into an eerie silence. Hundreds of eyes fixed on him, and Dalton felt the weight of every single stare. One rider moved forward from the center. His horse was white, standing out against the sea of brown and black mounts. The man sat tall in the saddle, wearing a full headdress of white and brown feathers that caught the wind. His face was weathered and marked with thin scars that ran across his cheeks like war paint that never washed off. He looked to be in his 50s, but his posture belonged to someone who'd never learned to bow. Authority radiated from him like heat from a fire. The leader stopped his horse about 10 feet from where Dalton stood. Neither man spoke. Dalton had heard stories about Apache warriors his whole life. Most of them told by men who'd never actually met one. Standing here now, facing what had to be a war chief with 300 fighters at his back, those stories felt thin and useless. The leader's dark eyes scanned Dalton from head to toe, taking in the torn clothing, the empty canteen, the rancho that looked ready to collapse in the next strong wind. Then the man's gaze shifted past Dalton toward the open door of the rancho. Dalton knew what he was looking for, who he was looking for. The leader raised one hand slowly, and the entire formation of warriors tensed. Dalton's heart hammered against his rib, so hard he thought it might crack through. The hand moved higher, fingers extending upward in a gesture Dalton couldn't interpret, and then every single rider dismounted at once. The synchronized movement sent another tremor through the ground. 300 warriors standing between him and the horizon. The leader swung down from his white horse and took a step forward. His hand rested on the shaft of a lance decorated with leather strips and feathers. His expression remained unreadable. Dalton's mouth went dry. His voice came out rough. When he finally spoke, "The boy's inside. He's alive." The leader didn't acknowledge Dalton's words. He simply walked forward, closing the distance between them with measured steps. Up close, the man was even more imposing, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they'd been breaking things since before Dalton was born. The scars on his face weren't random. They formed patterns, deliberate marks that told stories Dalton would never understand. The leader stopped inches away, so close Dalton could see the silver streaks in his hair beneath the headdress. For a long moment, the man just stared. His eyes moved across Dalton's face, then dropped to the torn shirt, the empty canteen still hanging from his belt, the raw exhaustion carved into every line of his body. Dalton forced himself to hold the gaze. If this was how it ended, he wouldn't go out looking at the ground. The silence stretched so tight it felt like it might snap and cut them both. Then the leader's eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger, something else. Recognition, maybe, or calculation. He reached out suddenly, and Dalton's muscles locked. But the man only lifted the empty canteen from his belt. He weighed it in his palm, turned it over, unscrewed the cap, and looked inside at. Nothing. His jaw tightened. When he let the canteen drop, it swung on its strap. Like a hangman. Without a word, the leader brushed past Dalton and walked toward the rancho. Dalton turned, but didn't follow. 300 warriors hadn't moved an inch, their eyes tracking every breath he took. The leader disappeared. Through the doorway, Dalton heard the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor inside. Then silence again. The seconds crawled by like wounded animals. Birds called somewhere in the distance. The only sound besides the occasional snort from one of the horses. When the leader emerged, his expression had changed. The hardness was still there, but something else had crept in around the edges. He stopped in the doorway and looked back. Inside one more time, as if confirming what he'd seen. Then his gaze swung back to Dalton. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, more complicated. The leader spoke for the first time, his voice deep and carrying, despite not being raised. The words were in Apache, flowing together in a way that made them sound almost musical. Dalton didn't understand a single syllable, but he caught the tone. Not threatening, but not friendly either. Somewhere in between. Testing maybe. The leader waited, watching for a reaction. "I don't speak your language," Dalton said. His voice cracked from thirst and fear in equal measure. "I just found him. Out there. He was dying. I did what I could." The leader's eyes flickered with something that might have been understanding. He stepped down from the doorway and walked a slow circle around Dalton, taking in every detail. The lack of weapons, the condition of the rancho, the absolute nothingness that surrounded them in every direction. When he completed the circle, he stopped in front of Dalton again and tilted his head slightly, as if asking a question. Without words, Dalton didn't know what to say. What could he say? That he was broke? That he'd given up his only water? Because some broken part of him couldn't watch a kid die? That he'd probably just signed his own death warrant? None of it will make sense. Hell, it barely made sense to him. The leader reached into a pouch at his side and pulled something out. A small leather flask. He held it up for a moment, making sure Dalton saw it clearly. Then he tossed it. Dalton caught it on instinct, his hands closing around the worn leather. It was heavy, full water. Before Dalton could process what that meant, the leader turned to face his warriors. He raised his right hand high, fist closed, then opened his fingers wide. Immediately, the entire formation began to move. Warriors reached for their horses, pulling items from saddlebags, bundles wrapped in cloth, containers, roll blankets. They started walking forward, dozens of them, converging on the rancho from all sides. Dalton stood frozen, the flask heavy in his hand, watching 300 Apache warriors descend on his property with their arms full. He had no idea if this was the beginning of something or the end. The warriors moved with purpose, laying bundles at Dalton's feet and near the rancho entrance, dried meat wrapped in cloth, leather pouches that sloshed with water, woven blankets, and patterns Dalton had never seen before. They didn't speak to him, didn't even look at him directly. They simply placed their offerings and stepped back, returning to their positions in the larger formation. Within minutes, Dalton was surrounded by more resources than he'd seen in half a year. He stood there holding the flask, too stunned to drink. His brain kept trying to catch up with what was happening, but exhaustion and confusion made everything feel thick and slow. The leader, Kuruk, though Dalton didn't know, his name yet. Watched the distribution with the same unreadable expression. When the last warrior had placed his bundle and retreated, Kurik turned back to Dalton and gestured toward the flask. Dalton unscrewed the cap with shaking hands. The first sip hit his throat like salvation. He forced himself to stop after 3 swallows. Every instinct screaming at him to drain it dry, but some part of him knew better. Kurik nodded once, a small acknowledgement. That carried weight. Then he moved toward the rancho door again, pausing to look back at Dalton and tilt his head. An invitation or command. Dalton couldn't tell which. Inside, the boy was awake. His eyes were open and clearer. Now, though fear still lived in them. When he saw Kurik, his whole body went rigid. He tried to sit up despite the pain it clearly caused. Kurik moved to him quickly, placing a hand on his shoulder and speaking in that flowing Apache tongue. The boy's tension melted immediately. He responded in the same language, his voice weak but urgent. Dalton caught the way the boy kept glancing at him while speaking, pointing with one trembling hand. Kurik listened, without interrupting, his expression shifting through emotions Dalton couldn't name. When the boy finished, Kurik stood and turned to face Dalton. He pointed at the boy, then at himself, then made a gesture that looked like he was cradling something small. Family. The word didn't need translation. The pieces started falling into place in Dalton's mind. The massive response, the careful inspection, the gifts. This wasn't just any kid. Kurik spoke again, this time slower, as if trying to force understanding through sheer will. When Dalton shook his head helplessly, Kurik's jaw tightened in frustration. He looked around the rancho, his eyes landing on the dirt floor. He knelt and began drawing with his finger, creating shapes and lines. A circle, smaller circles inside it, then a single circle, separated from a group. He pointed at the separated circle, then at the boy. Lost. The boy had been lost. Next, Kurik drew a figure in the dirt, rough but recognizable as a person. He pointed at the figure, then at Dalton. Then he drew an axe through half the figure and gestured at Dalton's torn shirt. The empty canteen still hanging at his belt. Sacrifice. Dalton's throat tightened. Kurik had seen it all. The poverty, the desperation, the choice to give up his own survival for a stranger. Kurik drew one more thing. 2 circles side by side, connected by a line. He pointed at one circle, then at himself, pointed at the other, then at Dalton. His meaning was crystal clear, even without words. Connected, now bound. The question in Dalton's mind wasn't whether he wanted this connection. That choice had already been made when he tilted that canteen to the boy's lips. The question was what this connection would cost. Kurik stood and walked to the doorway, looking out at his warriors assembled in the morning light. He spoke over his shoulder, a string of words that sounded almost like a question. Dalton understood none of it, but the tone was unmistakable. An offer was being made, or maybe a test. Kurik turned back, his eyes boring into Dalton's with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. The boy said something from the bench, his voice barely above a whisper. Kurik's expression softened for just a moment, then hardened again. He looked at Dalton and made a new gesture, hand extended, palm up, then closing into a fist and bringing it to his chest. Trust or loyalty or both. Dalton realized that whatever happened next would define the rest of his life. Over the next hour, more Apaches entered the rancho. These ones were different. Older men with weathered faces who carried themselves with the same authority as Kurik. Elders, Dalton guessed. They examined the boy carefully, checking his wound and speaking to him in low tones. One of them produced a leather pouch and pulled out what looked like ground herbs. He mixed them with water from one of the flasks and made the boy drink it. Natural medicine, not mystical, just knowledge passed down through generations. Dalton watched from the corner, feeling increasingly like an outsider in his own home. Kurik stood near the door, arms crossed, observing everything. When the elders finished their examination, they gathered around Kurik and held a quiet discussion. Dalton caught the way they kept glancing at him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. One elder, his face deeply lined and his hair completely white, seemed particularly doubtful. He pointed at Dalton and spoke sharply to Kurik, who responded with equal firmness. The discussion went on for several minutes, voices rising and falling. Finally, the white-haired elder threw up his hands in what looked like reluctant acceptance and walked out. The others followed, leaving just Kurik, Dalton, and the boy. The tension in the room eased slightly. Kurik moved to stand directly in front of Dalton, and this time when he spoke, he accompanied each word with deliberate gestures. He pointed at the rancho's crumbling walls, then made a building motion with his hands, stacking invisible blocks. He gestured at the resources piled outside. Then he pointed at Dalton and swept his arm wide, encompassing the entire territory beyond the door. Protection, resources, help, all of it offered clearly through movement and expression alone. But then Kurik's gestures changed. He pointed at Dalton, then at himself, then made a bridge shape with his hands. He pointed outside where two groups of invisible people stood on opposite sides of his hand bridge. One side he indicated with gestures that suggested his own people. The other side he indicated with gestures toward the direction of the nearest settlement. White settlers. The meaning crashed into Dalton like a horse at full gallop. They wanted a mediator, someone who belonged to neither side, but had earned trust from both. Dalton's first instinct was to refuse. He'd spent his whole life trying to stay invisible, to avoid politics and conflicts bigger than himself. That strategy had kept him alive, if not prosperous. But looking around his failing rancho, at the boy who'd lived because of choice he barely understood himself, at Kurik standing there with an offer that came from genuine respect rather than pity, refusal suddenly felt like cowardice. He thought about the stories he'd heard. Settlers stealing land, Apaches raiding settlements, cycles of revenge that fed themselves until nobody remembered who started what. Both sides dug into hatred, like it was bedrock. But what if someone existed in between? Someone poor enough that neither side could accuse him of profit-seeking. Someone who'd proven he'd sacrifice for a stranger. Someone too exhausted to carry hatred. Dalton met Kurik's eyes and gave a single slow nod. The relief that crossed the war chief's face lasted only a second, before his usual stoic mask returned. But Dalton caught it. This mattered to Kurik. Really mattered. The leader placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head slightly. A gesture of respect between equals. Then Kurik walked to the doorway and called out to his warriors. Immediately, men began moving with renewed purpose. Some headed toward the rancho with tools and materials. Others started marking out areas near the structure. Kurik turned back to Dalton and made one more gesture. Palm out, then turned upward. Wait. Whatever was about to happen would take time. The boy spoke again from a bench, his voice stronger now. Kurik smiled for the first time, a brief flash of warmth that transformed his severe features. He responded to the boy, then looked at Dalton and pointed at him. The boy's gaze followed, and he said something that sounded almost like gratitude. Dalton stepped outside to see what was happening and stopped short. The warriors weren't just unloading supplies. They were building, repairing walls, organizing materials into organized piles, creating something functional from a skeleton of his failed rancho. But in the distance, Dalton noticed something else. A thin line of dust rising from the horizon, heading straight toward them. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving into shapes. That made Dalton's stomach tighten. 6 riders, moving fast, not Apaches. These Men sat differently in their saddles. And even from a distance, Dalton could make out the style of hats and clothing that belonged to settlers, probably bounty hunters or ranch hands from one of the larger properties to the east. Men who made their living off conflict and wouldn't think twice about starting one. Kurik saw them too. His whole posture changed, shoulders squaring, and hand moving to the lance he'd propped against the rancho wall. Around them, the warriors stopped their work. Tools were set down carefully, deliberately, and hands moved to weapons with practiced ease. The transformation happened in seconds from builders back to fighters. The air itself seemed to thicken with tension. Dalton's new role was about to get tested before he'd had time to understand what it meant. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Kurik and the approaching riders. The warchief's eyes cut to him. Sharply, a clear question in them. Dalton held up one hand. Wait. Trust me. He wasn't sure Kurik wasn't sure he deserved that trust yet, but he had to try. This was the bridge they'd agreed on, and bridges only worked if both sides used them. The 6 riders slowed as they got close enough to see what they were riding into. Dalton watched their faces change, watched them process the scene. 300 Apache warriors surrounding a falling down rancho, tools and weapons within easy reach, a lone white man standing in the middle of it. All. The lead rider, a thick shouldered man with a rust-cold beard, raised his hand to stop his group about 50 yards out. That you, Cale? The bearded man called, his voice carried across the distance, rough with suspicion. It's me, Briggs, Dalton called back. He knew the man slightly. They'd crossed paths a few times in town, back when Dalton could still afford to go to town. Briggs worked for the Keller Ranch, running security and handling problems. The kind of man who saw Apaches as problems needing handling. Hell's going on here? Briggs's eyes swept the scene, counting warriors, calculating odds. His hand rested near the rifle strapped to his saddle. You being held? Dalton could feel Kurik's presence behind him like a physical force. Could sense the hundreds of warriors waiting for any sign that violence was about to start. His next words mattered more than any he'd ever spoken. No one's holding me, Dalton said clearly. These men are helping me rebuild. There was an accident. A boy got lost and hurt. I helped him. They came to bring him home and to thank me. That's all. That's all. Briggs barked out a harsh laugh. 300 warriors show up. And that's all. You gone soft in the head from hunger, Cale? No more than usual. Dalton took several steps toward Briggs, putting more distance between himself and the Apaches, making himself the focus. You can see I'm fine. The boy's fine. Nobody's looking for trouble here. One of the other riders, younger with nervous eyes, spoke up. Keller sent us to check reports of war parties moving through. People are scared. This many warriors heading towards settled land. They're not heading anywhere, Dalton interrupted. They came here for personal reasons. They'll leave when they're ready, and nobody needs to get worried about it. Briggs studied him for a long moment, eyes narrowed. You vouching for them? The question hung in the air like smoke. Dalton felt the weight of it, understood that his answer would ripple outward beyond this moment. Behind him, Kurik hadn't moved, but Dalton could sense him listening, understanding more of the exchange than his lack of English should allow, reading tone and posture the way men did when words failed. Yeah, Dalton said, I am. Briggs's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. His hand stayed near his rifle, but he didn't reach for it. Keller ain't going to like this. Having you as a buffer is one thing. Having you pick sides is another. I'm not picking sides. I'm standing in the middle. That's the point. The tension stretched out so thin it felt transparent. Then Briggs spat into the dust and gathered his res. We're leaving, Briggs said finally. But I'll be telling Keller what I saw here. He'll want to talk to you himself soon. I'll be here, Dalton replied. It wasn't like He could go anywhere else. Briggs gave one last hard look at the assembled warriors, then wheeled his horse around. The other 5 riders followed, kicking up dust as they headed back the way they came. Dalton watched until they disappeared over the ridge, his heart still hammering against his ribs. Only when they were completely gone did he allow his shoulders to drop. Behind him, the tension broke like a snapped rope. Warriors returned to their work, the sound of building resuming as if nothing had happened. But Kurik approached slowly, his expression different now. The skepticism that had lingered in his eyes was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like approval. He stopped beside Dalton, both of them watching the empty horizon where the riders had vanished. Kurik spoke, his voice carrying a tone Dalton was starting to recognize acknowledgement. Then he did something unexpected. He reached out and gripped Dalton's shoulder, squeezed once firmly, and released. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight. Acceptance. Respect earned rather than given. When Kurik turned back toward the rancho, there was a subtle shift in how the other warriors looked at Dalton, too. He'd proven something today. The rest of the day passed in steady work. Dalton tried to help where he could, though exhaustion and malnutrition made him clumsy. The warriors worked around him with patient efficiency, their movements coordinated from years of working together. By the time the sun started its descent, the rancho had been transformed. Walls were reinforced, holes were patched. A proper corral had been built near the side. Corral with an A for horses, not coral. From the ocean, the structure looked more solid than it had in years. The elders emerged from inside where they'd been tending to the boy. The white-haired one who'd been skeptical earlier approached Kurik and spoke at length. Dalton caught his name being mentioned, saw the elder gestured toward where the confrontation with Briggs had happened. Kurik responded, and whatever he said made the elder's expression soften slightly. Not warm, but less. Hostile progress. As darkness approached, Kurik gave orders that sent most of the warriors to set up a temporary camp about a/4 mile from the rancho. They moved out in organized groups, leaving behind a smaller contingent of maybe 20 men who continued working by the light of carefully controlled fires. Kurik remained, supervising and occasionally adjusting something the workers had done. Dalton sat on the newly repaired porch, drinking water from one of the flasks and eating dried meat that tasted better than anything he could remember. His body was slowly remembering what it felt like to not be starving. The boignol he'd learned the name through repetition was resting inside, his fever broken and wound properly dressed. He'd live. That decision Dalton made in the desert had saved a life. And somehow that single choice had changed everything. Kurik eventually came to sit beside him. Neither spoke for a while. The silence wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was the silence of 2 men who'd reached an understanding without needing every detail spelled out. After a time, Kurik pulled something from his pouch, a small carved piece of bone on a leather cord. He held it up so Dalton could see the markings etched into it, then pressed it into Dalton's hand and closed his fingers around it. Dalton looked down at the object, then up at Kurik questioningly. The war chief pointed at Dalton's chest, then at his own, then made that bridge gesture again with his hands. A symbol, something to show others what role Dalton now held. Protection and burden both wrapped together. Kurik stood and looked out at the camp in the distance. Then back at Dalton, he made a sweeping gesture that encompassed everything. The rancho, the land, the future. Then he placed his hand over his heart and nodded once. A promise. Whatever came next, Dalton wouldn't face it alone. 6 weeks changed everything. The rancho that had been falling apart now stood solid and functional, its walls straight and its roof sealed against the weather. The corral held 4 horses, gifts from Kurik's people that Dalton was still learning to care for properly. Storage structures lined one side of the property, filled with supplies that meant he wouldn't face starvation again. The transformation was so complete that riders passing by often didn't recognize it as the same place. Dalton stood in the doorway watching Nall approach on a small brown mare. The boy's leg had healed well, leaving only a scar that would fade with time. He came by twice a week now, sometimes with messages from Kurik, sometimes just a visit. They developed a simple communication, part gesture, part broken attempts at each other's languages, part shared silence. The boy was teaching him Apache words, slowly, and Dalton was teaching him better English. Neither would ever be fluent in the other's tongue, but understanding didn't always need perfect words. Your grandfather? Dalton asked, as Neil dismounted, using the Apache word Kurik had taught him for the relationship. With the Eastern camp, Neil replied in careful English. 3 days. Then here he held up 3 fingers to be clear. Kurik had established a semi-permanent camp about 5 miles north, close enough to respond to trouble, but far enough to avoid spooking the settlers. His warriors rotated through in groups, maintaining presence without threatening anyone. It was a delicate balance, but it held. The arrangement had prevented 2 potential conflicts already. Once when young settlers had strayed onto traditional Apache hunting grounds, and once when Apache hunters had been accused of stealing livestock they'd never touched. Dalton had stood in the middle both times, translating not just words, but intentions, helping both sides see past their assumptions. Keller had come to visit 3 weeks ago. The ranch owner himself, rather than sending men. The meeting had been tense, full of questions and barely concealed suspicion, but Dalton had shown him the carved bone token, explained the arrangement, and made it clear he answered to neither side while serving both. Keller hadn't liked it, but he'd accepted it. Practical men understood practical solutions and avoiding bloodshed was as practical as it got. Nall followed Dalton inside where they sat at the table, another new addition, and shared dried fruit. The boy talked about his training with the warriors, how his grandfather was teaching him to track and hunt properly now that his leg was strong again. There was pride in his voice, but also something else, gratitude that went beyond words. This kid understood what Dalton's choice in the desert had meant, understood it in a way that went deeper than simple rescue. My grandfather says you are a changed man, Neil said after a while, his English improving with each visit. How's that? Dalton asked. Neil struggled for the words, his face scrunched in concentration. Before you were pushed down by life, now you are. He made a gesture, shoulders back, chin up. You stand. Dalton considered that. The kid wasn't wrong. Poverty had bent him over, made him small and invisible. But standing between 2 groups who could destroy each other that required being seen, required having a spine. The responsibility had straightened something in him that hunger had curved. When Neil left an hour later, Dalton walked him out to his horse. The boy mounted easily despite his young age, natural in the saddle in a way Dalton envied. Before riding off, Neil touched his hand to his chest. The same gesture Kurik made and said something in Apache that Dalton was starting to understand. Brother, not by blood, but by choice and debt and shared survival. Dalton watched the boy ride north toward the camp, then turned to look at his property. The rancho stood solid. The corral held healthy animals. Food and water were stored safely. But more than that, he had purpose now. He had proven that mercy wasn't weakness and that poverty didn't define worth. A single canteen of water given to a dying boy had brought 300 warriors to his door. And instead of ending his life, they'd given him a new one. He touched the carved bone hanging around his neck, his symbol of standing in the middle, and allowed himself something he hadn't felt in years. Hope, not the desperate kind that came from wishing things would change, but the solid kind that came from knowing he'd already changed them. Dalton Cale was no Longer the broke cowboy who'd been forgotten by the world. He was the bridge between two of them. And 300 Apache warriors made sure nobody would forget that. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where courage and destiny collide in the untamed frontier. Don't forget to subscribe and consider leaving a super chat to help us bring you more stories like this. Your support means everything.